Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Breathing smoke and silence. Waking up in an industrial Victorian city. You wake before the sun, not because you wish to, but because the city insists upon it. The sound reaches you first. A distant clatter of carts, iron-rimmed wheels striking uneven stone. Somewhere nearby, a factory bell rings once, then again, its dull metal note carrying through the fog. It is not meant for you alone. It is meant for thousands of bodies that must move at roughly the same time, regardless of sleep, sickness, or season. In a Victorian industrial city, London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, morning does not arrive gently. It arrives with instruction. The air in your room is already stale. Windows are rarely opened at night, even in summer. Fresh air is widely believed to invite illness, especially the feared night air, thought to carry dangerous miasmas. Your bedroom, if it can be called that, may be a shared space. In working-class districts, entire families sleep in one room, sometimes in one bed. The floor may be bare wood, worn smooth by decades of feet. Damp creeps up from the ground, clinging to walls and bedding alike. You breathe in, and your lungs fill with smoke before your feet touch the floor. Coal smoke specifically. It has settled into everything: curtains, clothes, hair, skin. The city burns coal endlessly for heat, for cooking, for factories, for gasworks. Even before dawn, chimneys exhale a constant haze. On still mornings, it hangs low, turning street lamps into blurred halos and mooting sound. On colder days, it presses down, thick enough to taste. You clear your throat. Many Victorians do this first thing in the morning. Coughing is not remarkable. It is a shared rhythm of city life. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, and lung damage are common long before anyone names them as occupational or environmental diseases. Children cough. Elderly people cough. Workers in their 20s cough as if they are already old. Breakfast is modest if it exists at all. For the poor, it may be bread stale, cheap, sometimes stretched with fillers you cannot see. Tea, if you are fortunate, though even tea can be suspect. Leaves are often reused or mixed with other dried plants. Sugar is precious. Milk is risky. It may be watered down or worse, contaminated from diseased cows or filthy containers. As you eat or simply prepare to leave without eating, you become aware of the smell again. Not just coal smoke now, but refuse, human waste, animal waste, rotting food. Victorian cities struggle under the weight of their own population. London alone holds over 2 million people by the mid-19th century, many packed into neighborhoods never designed for such density. Most homes lack indoor plumbing. Chamber pots are emptied in the morning, sometimes carefully into cesspits, sometimes dumped into the street or nearby river. Rain helps when it comes. When it doesn't, the waste lingers. Flies thrive. So do rats. You step outside, pulling your coat close. Even here, the danger is quiet but constant. The street surface is uneven, slick with mud, manure, and yesterday's rain. A wrong step can mean a twisted ankle or a fall into filth. In an era before antibiotics, a simple cut can fester. Infection does not need much invitation. Children are already awake. Some are barefoot even in cold weather. Others carry baskets, bundles, or tools too large for their frames. School attendance exists, but it competes with hunger. Many children work before lessons, after lessons, or instead of lessons entirely. Their small hands are useful in factories, mines, and workshops. Their bodies are cheap. You walk carefully. Horse-drawn traffic dominates the streets, and horses do not stop quickly. Neither do the carts behind them. Accidents are frequent and often fatal. Broken limbs are common. Being crushed under wheels is not unusual. Newspapers report such deaths regularly, often with a tone of resigned familiarity. The buildings loom close. Many are blackened with soot, their original colors long forgotten. Narrow streets trap smoke and noise. Light struggles to reach the ground. In poorer districts, houses are subdivided again and again, rooms partitioned into smaller rooms until ventilation becomes nearly impossible. Disease thrives in such conditions. And disease is everywhere, though rarely understood. You may have heard of cholera. Everyone has. It arrives in waves, unpredictable and terrifying. It kills quickly, draining the body of fluids until death comes within hours. The prevailing belief is that cholera spreads through foul air. Few yet accept that contaminated water is the true culprit. As a result, efforts focus on smell rather than sanitation. Streets are cleaned to improve odor, not safety. Wells remain poisoned. Even on days when cholera is absent, other illnesses wait patiently. Typhoid, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, influenza, measles, smallpox still lingers. Life expectancy statistics are misleading. Many who survive childhood live into their 60s, but childhood itself is a narrow bridge. Infant mortality is devastatingly high. Many families expect to lose children. Grief becomes routine, spoken of quietly, endured publicly. As you make your way through the morning streets, you notice the silence beneath the noise. People do not linger. There is little idle conversation. Time is measured differently here. Work hours are long, often 12 to 14 hours a day. Being late can mean dismissal. Dismissal can mean hunger. Hunger can mean the workhouse, and the workhouse is feared almost as much as disease. You pass a factory entrance. Men and women gather, heads down, lunch pails in hand. The building hums even before the shift begins. Inside, machines will roar loud enough to damage hearing permanently. Cotton dust will fill the air, slicing into lungs. Fingers will be lost. Accidents will be recorded, if at all, as unfortunate but expected. No one speaks of workplace safety yet. The idea barely exists. Survival depends on attention, habit, and luck. You continue walking, perhaps toward your own place of labor, perhaps toward an errand. Along the way, you pass posters pasted to brick walls, advertisements for patent medicines promising cures for everything from headaches to melancholy. Many contain alcohol, opium, or mercury. They soothe, sometimes, and slowly poison. A woman hurries past you, skirts lifted slightly to avoid the worst of the street. Her corset restricts her breathing, but fashion and respectability demand it. Long-term damage to ribs and organs is common, though rarely discussed. Pain is simply part of being respectable. The fog thickens as the sun rises. It is not a natural fog, not entirely. It is smoke mixed with mist, turning daylight into a dull gray. Gas lamps remain lit longer than they should. Visibility shrinks. The city feels enclosed, even outdoors. And yet life continues. Shops open. Bells ring again. People adapt. They always do. You take another breath, shallow now, unconsciously cautious. You have survived the morning so far, but the day is long, and danger in this city is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It settles into your lungs, your water, your walls, your habits. As you move forward into the day, surrounded by millions doing the same, you might wonder, how did people endure this environment day after day without truly understanding what was harming them, and what quiet strategies did they develop just to make it to nightfall? By the time the morning settles into something recognizable as day, you have already adjusted yourself without thinking. Your breathing is shallow, your pace is careful, your expectations are low. This, more than anything, is how people survive the Victorian city, not through strength or knowledge, but through quiet adaptation. You learn which streets to avoid after rain, where the mud deepens into something more treacherous. You learn which public pumps are rumored to be safer than others, though no one can quite explain why. You learn which factory foremen tolerate lateness, which landlords ignore repairs, which neighbors will share coal in winter and which will not. None of this is written down. It is passed through observation, habit, and rumor. As the day progresses, the smoke shifts. Morning smoke is domestic cooking fires, home hearths. By midday, industrial smoke takes over. Factory chimneys release steady columns of soot that drift with the wind, darkening some neighborhoods more than others. If you are wealthy enough to live uphill or upwind, you breathe slightly easier. Geography becomes a form of privilege. Inside buildings, air barely moves. Windows are small, often kept shut. Curtains block what little light exists, preserving warmth but trapping moisture. Wallpaper peels, and in many homes it contains arsenic-based dyes, bright greens especially prized. Over time, damp walls release invisible toxins. People complain of headaches, nausea, fatigue. The wallpaper is blamed less often than the body itself. You may pause at midday for a meal if your work allows it. Meals are repetitive and filling rather than nutritious. Bread, potatoes, cheap cuts of meat if available. Fresh fruits and vegetables are limited for the urban poor, expensive and quick to spoil. Food adulteration is rampant. Flour may contain chalk. Sweets may contain toxic dyes. Beer is safer than water, ironically, but even it can be tampered with. Yet people eat. They must. Hunger dulls concentration, and concentration is survival. The city does not rest at noon. Children dart between carts selling newspapers or matches. Street vendors call out their goods. The noise is constant, layered, exhausting. Over time, you stop noticing it. Silence becomes unfamiliar, even unsettling. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolls the hour. Churches dot the city, offering spiritual structure if not physical safety. Many also serve as centers of charity, distributing bread, soup, or coal to those deemed deserving. Respectability matters. Cleanliness matters. Moral judgment often determines who receives help and who does not. Illness is handled similarly. If you fall sick, you may miss work. Missing work means losing wages. Losing wages means falling behind on rent. Falling behind on rent means eviction. There is no safety net, only a series of thresholds you try not to cross. Doctors exist, but access is uneven. Medical science is advancing unevenly too. Some physicians advocate cleanliness and fresh air, others still rely on bloodletting. Germ theory is not yet widely accepted. The idea that invisible organisms cause disease is controversial, even offensive to some. Instead, miasma theory dominates. Bad smells are blamed for illness. As a result, efforts to improve public health focus on odor control rather than sanitation. Streets may be scrubbed, perfumes used, drains flushed occasionally without addressing the contaminated water beneath. You might notice that some families boil their water, though they cannot explain why it seems to help. Others add alcohol. Some avoid certain pumps altogether. These small choices, repeated daily, quietly save lives. Survival strategies evolve not from understanding, but from pattern recognition. As afternoon wears on, fatigue sets in. Work is repetitive, physically demanding, mentally draining. Factory workers stand for hours. Seamstresses hunch over needles. Clerks copy figures by hand. Coal heavers carry impossible loads. Bodies wear out quickly. Pain is expected. Rest is a luxury. When accidents happen, and they do, you witness the aftermath rather than the event. A man missing fingers, a woman limping, a child suddenly absent. Compensation is rare. Blame is personal. Carelessness is the usual explanation, even when machines lack guards or conditions are hazardous by design. You leave work as daylight fades, though in winter it may already be dark. Gaslights flicker on, illuminating streets unevenly. Shadows deepen. Crime increases with darkness, but so does community vigilance. People walk together when they can. They recognize faces. Strangers are noticed immediately. The evening air is colder, heavier. Smoke settles again. You feel it in your chest, a tightness you barely acknowledge. Many Victorians develop what they call a winter cough, though it rarely leaves in summer. At home, warmth is relative. Coal is expensive. Fires are kept small. Damp persists. Bedding is aired when possible, though air itself is suspect. Cleanliness is valued but difficult. Water must be carried. Soap costs money. Baths are infrequent, shared, or improvised. Still, there is routine. Supper. Conversation. Maybe reading aloud if someone can read. Literacy is improving slowly. Newspapers spread information and fear in equal measure. Reports of outbreaks, disasters, reforms debated in Parliament, these connect ordinary lives to distant decisions. Before sleep, you prepare again for tomorrow. Clothes are laid out, boots checked, small injuries cleaned as best you can. You may say a prayer or simply lie still, listening to the city breathe around you. Night is not quiet. Factories run late. Carts move through darkness. Drunken voices rise and fall. Somewhere someone coughs violently. Somewhere else a baby cries. Life continues even when it hurts. You close your eyes knowing that morning will come whether you are ready or not. You have learned how to live here, but not why it is this way, and perhaps you have begun to sense that the city itself is changing slowly, under the weight of its own damage. And that leads to another question. When suffering became impossible to ignore, what finally forced Victorian cities to confront the invisible dangers they had learned to live with for so long? Change in a Victorian city does not arrive suddenly. It creeps in, uneven and contested, shaped as much by exhaustion as by enlightenment. For years, decades, really the dangers you live with remain largely invisible to those with the power to alter them. Smoke is unpleasant but profitable. Overcrowding is unfortunate but efficient. Disease is tragic but accepted. The city grows faster than understanding can keep pace, and so suffering becomes ordinary. But ordinary suffering has a way of accumulating. The turning point does not come from compassion alone. It comes from patterns too stark to ignore. Cholera returns again and again, cutting through neighborhoods with alarming precision. Entire streets fall ill while others remain untouched. The poor suffer most, yes, but not exclusively. Clerks, shopkeepers, even the comfortably middle class begin to die in numbers that attract attention. One outbreak in particular forces a pause. In 1854, in the Soho district of London, cholera strikes hard and fast. Deaths cluster around a single public water pump on Broad Street. A physician named John Snow, already skeptical of miasma theory, begins to map cases meticulously. He speaks to families. He tracks water sources. He notices that those who avoid the pump often avoid the disease. Snow's conclusions are not immediately accepted. The idea that water clear, tasteless, odorless could carry death is deeply unsettling. It contradicts everything people think they know about cleanliness and smell. Still, the handle of the Broad Street pump is removed. The outbreak slows. It is a small moment, easy to dismiss, but it lingers. Elsewhere, similar realizations form. Engineers begin to argue for proper sewer systems, not just drains that move waste from one street to another. Reformers publish reports detailing housing conditions so grim they shock even seasoned readers. Illustrations and photographs, new tools make suffering visible to those who have never walked those streets. You may not notice these changes immediately in your daily routine. The smoke still fills your lungs. The streets remain crowded. Work is still long and punishing. But gradually, infrastructure begins to shift beneath your feet. In London, massive sewer projects reshape the city's relationship with waste. Rivers once used as open sewers are redirected, controlled, partially cleansed. The Thames, infamous for its stench during the Great Stink of 1858, becomes impossible for lawmakers themselves to ignore when the smell reaches Parliament. Legislation follows discomfort. This is a recurring theme. Reform arrives when suffering crosses class boundaries. Housing acts attempt often inadequately to regulate overcrowding. Factory acts limit working hours, especially for women and children. Inspections are introduced, though enforcement is inconsistent. Still, the idea that the state bears some responsibility for public health begins to take root. For you living through this transition, the experience is confusing. Old beliefs persist alongside new ones. You may boil water but still fear night air. You may welcome sewers but distrust ventilation. Progress is uneven, layered on top of habits formed through necessity rather than science. There is resistance too. Factory owners protest regulations. Landlords resist costly repairs. Newspapers argue about individual responsibility versus public obligation. Some claim that suffering builds character. Others insist it is simply the price of progress. Meanwhile, people continue to adapt in quieter ways. You might move slightly farther from the factory if wages allow. You might choose lodgings on a higher floor to avoid damp. You might send children to the countryside when illness spreads, if you have relatives willing to take them. These strategies are personal, fragile, and often temporary, but they matter. Over time, mortality rates begin to shift. Infant deaths slowly decline. Life expectancy inches upward not because life is suddenly easy, but because fewer people die young. These changes are incremental, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime. By the late Victorian period, the city you wake up in is not the same one your parents knew. Smoke still hangs in the air, but awareness has sharpened. Illness is no longer explained solely by fate or morality. The language of germs, sanitation, and prevention begins to replace older fears of smell and shadow. Yet it is important to understand what does not change. Work remains demanding. Inequality persists. Poverty does not disappear with plumbing. The risks shift rather than vanish. New machines introduce new dangers. New chemicals replace old ones. Industrial progress continues to test the limits of the human body. Still, the foundation has moved. The idea that everyday life should not quietly kill you, that survival should not depend entirely on endurance, takes hold. When you lie down at night now, perhaps decades after that earlier morning thick with smoke, you may still cough. You may still worry about rent, about work, about the next illness. But you also live in a world shaped by those who noticed patterns, asked uncomfortable questions, and insisted that ordinary suffering was worth investigating. The Victorian city did not become safer because its people were stronger than others. It became safer because survival itself became evidence. And when you think about modern life, clean water flowing invisibly into homes, waste carried away without thought, air quality measured and debated, you are living among the quiet outcomes of those grim mornings, those coughing streets, those adaptations made without understanding. The dangers have changed, the lesson has not. History reminds you that what feels normal can still be deadly, and that progress often begins not with heroics, but with boredom, routine, and the simple refusal to accept that this is just how life must be. Story 2: Drinking Death, Water, Cholera, and the Hidden Thread in Every Cup. You are thirsty, and that should be a simple thing. In a Victorian city, it rarely is. Water surrounds you, rivers, canals, pumps, cisterns, but none of it is quite what it seems. It flows through the city carrying not just life, but the accumulated byproducts of millions of other lives. Every sip is a calculation you may not realize you are making. You begin your day needing water for everything: drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning. Yet clean water as a concept is still poorly defined. Clarity is mistaken for purity, coldness for freshness, smell for safety. If water looks clear and does not offend the nose, it is usually considered acceptable. This assumption quietly kills people. Public water pumps dot the streets, often placed for convenience rather than safety. They draw from shallow wells, underground sources easily contaminated by nearby cesspits and drains. In dense neighborhoods, waste has nowhere to go but down, seeping into the same ground that supplies drinking water. You may know this pump is bad, though you cannot say why. Perhaps people who use it fall ill more often. Perhaps a neighbor warned you. Perhaps it simply tastes wrong. So you walk a little farther to another pump, carrying water back in heavy buckets that strain your arms and back. This extra effort, repeated daily, may save your life. Most households store water indoors in open containers. Dust settles into it. Insects fall in. Children dip unwashed hands. Boiling water helps, but fuel costs money, and boiling is time-consuming. Many do not bother unless illness forces the issue. Beer and tea become safer alternatives, not by design but by accident. Brewing and boiling kill pathogens, though no one yet understands that term. Even children drink small beer low in alcohol but safer than water. Tea becomes a daily ritual not just for comfort, but for survival. Milk, often assumed to be nourishing, is among the most dangerous drinks available. Cows are kept in filthy urban dairies, fed on waste from distilleries. Milk is diluted, preserved with chemicals, or transported in unclean containers. It spoils quickly. Infants fed contaminated milk die in shocking numbers. You may lose a child without ever knowing why. Cholera arrives like a rumor at first. A few people fall ill, then more. Symptoms escalate rapidly: vomiting, diarrhea, dehydration so severe that skin turns blue-gray and limbs cramp violently. Death can come within hours. Panic spreads faster than understanding. Authorities respond by addressing what they believe is the cause: smell. Streets are scrubbed. Lime is spread. Tar barrels are burned to purify the air. None of this stops the disease. You are told to avoid foul odors, to keep windows shut at night, to carry scented handkerchiefs. Meanwhile, the real danger flows invisibly through pipes and wells. During outbreaks, the city changes its behavior. People flee if they can. The wealthy escape to the countryside. The poor remain. Quarantine signs appear on doors. Dead carts move through streets at dawn, collecting bodies before markets open. Newspapers publish daily death counts. Fear becomes routine. Yet cholera is not constant. It comes in waves: 1832, 1848, 1854, 1866, each time sparking debate, denial, and slow learning. Some doctors begin to question old assumptions. They notice patterns that smell cannot explain. Why do some neighborhoods suffer while others do not? Why do workers in the same air fall ill at different rates? You might overhear these debates in taverns, in print, in passing conversation. They feel abstract until the illness reaches your street. When it does, choices become urgent. Do you keep drinking from the same pump? Do you boil water despite the cost? Do you trust official advice or personal experience? There is no certainty, only risk management without language for probability. Most people survive not because they understand disease, but because they make cautious, repetitive decisions. They avoid what seems to bring harm. They imitate those who remain healthy. They endure. And yet you cannot help but notice how arbitrary it all feels. Two families, same street, same water source. One survives intact, the other does not. Grief feels random. Blame looks for somewhere to land. As the outbreak fades, life resumes. The pump remains. The well is still there. The danger has not been removed, only paused. You return to your routines, carrying water as you always have, wondering quietly how something so essential could also be so lethal, and why no one seems able to agree on what to do about it. And that leaves a lingering question. How long could a city keep drinking from its own contamination before someone finally proved, beyond argument, where the danger truly lay? When cholera retreats, it does not leave answers behind. It leaves absence. The dead are buried quickly, often without ceremony. Families return to work because they must. Streets are washed, not to remove danger but to restore order. Official notices are taken down. Pumps are reopened. Life resumes its old shape, even though something fundamental has been revealed and then carefully ignored. You carry water again as before. The bucket feels the same weight. The pump handle moves with the same familiar resistance. Nothing about the water announces that it once carried death. This is what makes it so difficult to confront. Unlike fires or collapses, water does not leave visible ruin. It does not blacken walls or crush bodies in public view. It slips quietly into homes and bodies, performing its daily role until it does something else entirely. And because it is essential, it cannot simply be avoided. The city debates itself endlessly over this contradiction. Medical journals fill with arguments. Some doctors insist cholera is contagious, spread by contact between people. Others argue it rises from filth and decay, emerging when cities become morally or physically corrupt. Still others, few, at first suggest that water itself is the vehicle. These voices are not equal. Authority favors tradition. Miasma theory fits comfortably with existing beliefs about cleanliness, class, and blame. If disease comes from foul air, then poor neighborhoods, crowded and smelly, are naturally at fault. Responsibility remains individual, not structural. You may sense this judgment even if you never read a medical pamphlet. Public advice often implies that illness follows bad habits. Drink spirits, avoid excess, keep your home tidy. When people fall ill despite following these rules, the contradiction is rarely addressed. In the meantime, engineers and surveyors begin to notice what doctors argue over. They map water sources, sewer lines, population density. They see how waste travels downhill, how wells sit dangerously close to cesspits, how rivers receive everything the city discards. These observations are practical rather than theoretical. They come from building, repairing, measuring, and slowly they begin to influence policy. Private water companies control much of the supply in Victorian Britain. They draw water from rivers increasingly polluted by upstream towns. Filtration is minimal or non-existent. Profit depends on volume, not purity. Regulation is weak. As a consumer, you have little choice. You use what is available. Complaints carry little weight unless they come from influential neighborhoods. Still, pressure builds. The memory of repeated cholera outbreaks lingers. So does the fear that they will return. When cases appear again, people react faster. Some pumps are closed more quickly. Boiling water becomes more common advice, though not universal. John Snow continues his work, though recognition comes slowly. His maps circulate among reformers. His arguments are debated, often dismissed, occasionally adopted. He does not live to see full acceptance of his ideas. Others take up the cause in different ways. Edwin Chadwick publishes reports on sanitation that are relentless in their detail. He describes conditions so thoroughly that they become difficult to deny. His tone is often cold, statistical, and morally charged but effective. The government responds not with immediate transformation, but with committees, inquiries, and incremental laws. The Public Health Act of 1848 is one such step. It acknowledges, for the first time, that public health is a matter of governance, not just personal behavior. For you, these shifts appear indirectly. A new drain is dug, a street is paved, a water company announces changes, fees rise, construction disrupts routines. Progress feels inconvenient rather than revolutionary. And yet beneath the surface, something important is happening. The idea that water should be protected from waste actively, deliberately begins to take hold. Sewer systems are redesigned to move waste away from water sources rather than into them. Filtration becomes more sophisticated. Intake points move upstream, farther from city pollution. These projects are enormous, expensive, and slow. They require years of labor, miles of brick tunnels, and political will that wavers constantly. But once built, they do something remarkable. They work quietly. Cholera outbreaks become less frequent. When they do occur, they are less severe. Infant mortality begins to decline. The change is subtle enough that many people do not notice it at first. There is no celebration when something does not happen. You still carry water, but perhaps from a tap rather than a pump. You still boil it sometimes, but not always. You may not fully trust it, but you no longer fear it in the same way. This transition is not uniform. Poorer districts benefit last. Rural areas lag behind. Even within cities, inequalities persist, but the trajectory is clear. Water, once an assumed danger, becomes something that can be managed. The irony is that understanding arrives only after catastrophe. Knowledge is extracted from loss. The lives that proved water could kill are gone, their contribution unrecorded except in numbers and maps. When you look back on this period, if you could, you might be surprised at how long it took to accept something so simple. That what you drink matters. That invisible threats require invisible solutions. And you might also notice how familiar the pattern feels. How often danger is tolerated until it becomes impossible to ignore. How change follows inconvenience more reliably than compassion. As evening falls and you lift a cup to your mouth, you no longer wonder if it will kill you tonight. But the memory remains, embedded in pipes, laws, and habits. Which leads to another question worth lingering over. Once water became safer, what other everyday dangers remained hidden in plain sight, quietly shaping Victorian life without drawing the same urgent attention? When clean water finally begins to arrive, it does so without ceremony. There is no single morning when you wake and think, the danger has passed. Instead, life simply becomes a little less fragile. Fewer funerals follow outbreaks of illness. Fewer children die in summer. The fear that once accompanied every stomach pain slowly loosens its grip. And because the improvement is gradual, it is easy to miss just how profound it is. You still remember the old habits, though. You hesitate before drinking. You prefer tea. You watch for rumors of sickness. Memory lingers longer than statistics. By the late Victorian period, something remarkable has happened. Water has become infrastructure rather than gamble. Underground, vast networks of pipes and sewers now move with purpose. Engineers, not physicians, become the quiet heroes of public health. Their work is unglamorous brick, mortar, gradients, flow rates, but it saves more lives than most medicines ever will. The acceptance of germ theory follows close behind. Once invisible organisms are acknowledged, the logic of sanitation becomes unavoidable. Clean water is no longer about smell or taste. It is about prevention. Disease is no longer divine punishment or moral failure. It is a process that can be interrupted. This shift changes how society thinks about responsibility. If water can be made safer through design, then suffering is not inevitable. If illness can be prevented collectively, then individual blame loses some of its power. These ideas unsettle long-standing beliefs about poverty, character, and fate. Not everyone welcomes them. Some argue that too much intervention weakens society. Others resent the cost. Water rates rise. Taxes fund projects that benefit neighborhoods far from Parliament. Resistance continues, but it grows quieter as results accumulate. You notice the difference in small ways. You wash more often. Laundry becomes less of an ordeal. Streets smell slightly less oppressive. The river no longer feels like a threat you must work around, but something that belongs to the city again, though it will take much longer to truly recover. Cholera fades into history, replaced by other concerns. Tuberculosis remains. Industrial accidents persist. Food adulteration continues unchecked for years. Clean water solves one problem, not all of them. But it sets a precedent. For the first time, an everyday necessity has been transformed by public action informed by evidence. The lesson is simple but powerful. Boredom saves lives. Maps, measurements, reports, pipes, these are not dramatic tools, but they endure. Looking back, the Victorian struggle with water reveals something deeply human. People endured terrible risk not because they were ignorant, but because danger was ordinary. It was woven into daily routines so thoroughly that it became invisible. Change required not just knowledge, but patience, persistence, and the willingness to challenge what felt normal. When you turn on a tap today without fear, without calculation, you are participating in the aftermath of that struggle. The water arrives clear, regulated, tested. Its safety is assumed so completely that it barely registers as a gift. That assumption is the real legacy. The Victorian city learned. slowly and painfully, that survival should not depend on guessing which pump might kill you. That lesson reshaped modern life more than most wars or laws ever did. And yet, even as one invisible danger was brought under control, others remained lurking in food, air, homes, and work itself waiting their turn to be noticed. Which invites a final reflection. How many dangers do people tolerate today, simply because they are familiar, and what will future generations wonder why we accepted for so long? Story 3. Streets of Mud and Manure, Walking Through the Victorian City. You step outside and immediately look down. This is not a habit born of modesty or shyness, but of survival. In a Victorian city, the ground is rarely neutral. It demands attention. It shifts, clings, conceals, and occasionally swallows. The street beneath your feet is not what a modern eye would recognize as a finished surface. Even where paving stones exist, they are uneven, cracked, or partially buried under layers of accumulated filth. In poorer districts, streets are often nothing more than packed earth, churned into mud by rain, traffic, and time. And traffic is constant. Horses dominate the city, thousands of them. They pull carts, omnibuses, delivery wagons, cabs. Each horse produces several pounds of manure every day, and much of it ends up exactly where you are walking. Add to this urine, rotting straw, spilled food, dead animals, and household waste, and the street becomes a living mixture rather than a surface. You learn to walk carefully. Your boots, if you have them, are sturdy but not waterproof. Mud seeps in through seams. In wet weather, it can rise to the ankle. In dry spells, it hardens into rutted ridges that trip the unwary. A fall is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. Scrapes become infected easily. Clothing ruined by filth may be impossible to clean properly. You lift your skirts if you wear them with practiced efficiency. Women develop a particular gait, balancing dignity against necessity. Showing too much ankle is improper. Stepping into refuse is worse. Street cleaning exists, but it is inconsistent and often symbolic. Sweeping tends to focus on main roads and commercial areas. Poorer streets wait longer. When cleaning does happen, it often means pushing filth to the sides, where it piles up until rain redistributes it. Rain is both curse and relief. It washes some waste away, but it also turns streets into slick channels of runoff. Water flows downhill, carrying everything with it into basements, doorways, cellars. Many homes sit below street level, especially in overcrowded areas. Flooding is common. Damp becomes permanent. You smell the street before you fully see it. The odor is complex, layered, familiar. Manure has a sharp tang. Rotting food adds sweetness. Human waste contributes a heavier note. Smoke weaves through it all. Over time, your nose adapts. Visitors notice the smell far more than residents do. This adaptation is not harmless. It makes danger easier to ignore. Children play in the streets because there is nowhere else. They know how to avoid carts, how to jump puddles, how to recognize the warning shout of a driver. Accidents still happen. Wheels crush feet. Horses bolt. But the street is also a social space, a place to sell, shout, gather, exist. You share it with everyone. There is no clear boundary between pedestrian and vehicle. You step aside when necessary. Drivers curse. Bells ring. Dogs weave through traffic. Geese are herded past shops. Pigs sometimes roam freely, feeding on refuse. They are unofficial cleaners, tolerated for their usefulness. At night, visibility drops sharply. Gas lamps are spaced unevenly and often poorly maintained. Shadows deepen. Holes disappear. Open drains become traps. You learn which routes are safer after dark, which corners to avoid. Crime thrives in these conditions, but so does community awareness. Neighbors recognize one another. Strangers stand out. A cry for help may be answered or ignored depending on context and fatigue. Shoes are status symbols here. A good pair suggests stability. Bare feet suggest poverty. Children often go without shoes entirely, their souls hardened by necessity. Cold and heat become sensations to endure rather than avoid. Mud follows you indoors. It coats thresholds, seeps into rugs, clings to hems. Cleaning it requires water which must be carried. Floors are scrubbed when possible, but the effort feels endless. Dirt returns faster than it can be removed. You might notice how quickly things decay. Wood rots, metal rusts, stone erodes. The environment is aggressive. Maintenance is constant and neglect shows immediately. This feeds a sense that nothing is permanent, that everything is slowly sinking. Street vendors set up where they can. Their goods are exposed to dust and flies. You buy anyway. There are few alternatives. Markets bustle with energy, noise, bargaining. Freshness is judged by sight and smell. Risk is part of every purchase. Occasionally, you see a dead animal, horse, dog, rat lying where it fell. Removal depends on reporting, manpower, and priorities. Until then, it becomes part of the street. Children poke it. Flies gather. The smell intensifies. Rats are everywhere, though you rarely see them in daylight. They live beneath the surface in sewers, cellars, piles of refuse. They are tolerated, feared, accepted. Cats hunt them. Traps are set. Still, they thrive. Walking long distances is tiring, not just because of distance, but because of concentration. You are always adjusting your steps, watching for hazards, reading the flow of movement around you. The street demands attention the way a river does. Yet people adapt. You develop shortcuts. You know which side of the street drains better. You step where others have stepped. You follow worn paths through mud, trusting collective judgment. Survival becomes collaborative, even without communication. There is also rhythm. Certain hours are busier, certain routes quieter. You time your errands accordingly. You learn when refuse carts pass, when streets are least crowded. And still, illness follows the street indoors. Filth clings to clothing, shoes, hands. Before germ theory, cleanliness is moral as much as practical. Dirt is associated with vice, even though it is often unavoidable. Shame attaches to circumstance. Reformers walk these streets and write about them. They measure, describe, condemn. Some do it to improve conditions, others to justify control. Change will come, eventually, but not yet. For now, you keep walking. Every journey is an exercise in endurance. Every step is a small negotiation with the environment. The street does not intend to harm you, but it does not care if it does. And as you navigate this shifting, treacherous ground day after day, you might begin to wonder, how did something as simple as walking become one of the most exhausting and dangerous parts of ordinary life? And what happened when the city finally tried to tame the ground beneath its own feet? Over time, the street teaches you its rules. You learn them the way you learn weather or hunger, not through instruction, but through repetition. Certain paths are safer. Certain times are worse. Certain shoes should never be worn after rain. The city does not explain itself. It corrects you when you misstep. Municipal authorities are aware of the streets, of course. They debate them endlessly. Reports are written, committees formed, budgets proposed. Street conditions are discussed in terms of efficiency, commerce, and appearance as much as health. A muddy street slows carts. A filthy street offends visitors. Danger to pedestrians is acknowledged but rarely centered. Street maintenance is fragmented. Responsibility shifts between parishes, boroughs, private owners, and contractors. This means that one block may be paved and swept regularly, while the next is neglected entirely. You notice the difference immediately when you cross an invisible boundary and your footing changes beneath you. In wealthier areas, paving stones are more carefully laid. Gutters are clearer. Sweeping is frequent. In poorer districts, streets wait. Filth accumulates not because residents care less, but because resources arrive later, if at all. This unevenness shapes daily movement. People root their lives around geography. Children are sent the long way to avoid particularly dangerous stretches. Vendors choose corners that stay drier. The sick walk less, not just from weakness but because every step carries risk. Mud is not merely unpleasant, it is exhausting. Walking through it requires constant muscular adjustment. Boots grow heavy. Feet ache. By the end of the day, fatigue is not just from work, but from the journey to and from it. In winter, the street hardens. Mud freezes into ridges that trip the careless. Ice forms in shallow depressions. Falls increase. Broken bones are common, especially among the elderly. A broken leg can mean the end of independence, the end of work, the beginning of institutional life. Snow is no cleaner. It absorbs filth, turning gray and brown within hours. Meltwater floods low areas. The street cycles endlessly between solid and liquid hazard. Despite this, the street is unavoidable. There are no sidewalks in the modern sense for much of the period. Where raised footpaths exist, they are narrow and uneven. You step up and down constantly, dodging carts that claim the center of the road by default. Drivers shout warnings, but noise carries poorly. Horses spook easily. A sudden sound can send them sideways, crushing whatever is in the way. You learn to read their bodies, the twitch of an ear, the tension in the reins. Street life is intimate. You are close to strangers in ways that feel unavoidable. You brush shoulders. You hear conversations not meant for you. Privacy is a luxury mostly reserved for indoors, and even there it is limited. Refuse collection improves slowly, but not enough to keep pace with population growth. Dust yards collect ash and waste, which are sorted for anything reusable. Children often work there, sifting through debris for salvageable items. The street feeds these systems constantly. Public health reformers focus on water and housing, but streets remain a stubborn problem. They are too large, too dynamic, too expensive to fix quickly. Paving costs money. Proper drainage requires planning. Street widening demands demolition. Still, pressure builds. Merchants complain about lost business. Physicians link street filth to disease, even if the mechanism is unclear. Middle-class residents, increasingly vocal, demand improvements that benefit them directly. Gradually, changes appear. More streets are paved with stone or asphalt. Gutters are redesigned to channel runoff more effectively. Regular street sweeping becomes a paid municipal service rather than an afterthought. Horse manure is collected and sold as fertilizer, creating incentive for removal. These changes matter, but they arrive unevenly. You may notice your street improve while others remain unchanged, or you may wait years while reforms happen elsewhere. Even improved streets are not safe by modern standards. Traffic remains chaotic, animals still dominate, waste still appears, but the worst hazards lessen. Walking becomes slightly less taxing, slightly less dangerous. The psychological shift is subtle. You begin to expect the ground to hold you, to trust it a little. This changes how you move through the city. Errands feel shorter. Distance shrinks. Children still play in the streets, but fewer injuries occur. Vendors stand more comfortably. Shoes last longer. Clothing stays cleaner. These small improvements ripple outward, altering daily life in ways rarely recorded. Looking back, it becomes clear that the street was never just a surface. It was a reflection of priorities. Where the street was neglected, people were expected to endure. Where it was improved, life became easier not through heroism but through design. And yet, even as the ground becomes more reliable, other dangers remain above it and within it, hidden in buildings, workplaces, and homes. Which raises another question worth considering. Once the street itself became safer to cross, where did the greatest everyday risks of Victorian life retreat to, and how long did it take before those dangers were finally confronted? When the street finally begins to change, it does so quietly, without anyone declaring it finished. There is no ribbon cutting for a paved road that no longer swallows your boot. No ceremony for a gutter that drains properly after rain. Improvement arrives in increments small enough to be overlooked, yet large enough to alter the rhythm of daily life. You feel it first in your body. Walking no longer requires the same constant vigilance. Your steps are more even, your pace steadier. You arrive at work less fatigued than you once did, though you may not immediately understand why. The ground beneath you has become more predictable, and predictability itself is a form of safety. Street paving spreads slowly across the city. Stone gives way to early asphalt in some areas, smoother and quieter underfoot. Drainage systems improve, redirecting runoff into sewers rather than doorways. Manure collection becomes organized, tied to agriculture beyond the city. What was once waste becomes commodity. These changes do not erase poverty or danger, but they reduce the daily tax the environment places on the body. Street lighting improves as well. Gas lamps are spaced more evenly, maintained more regularly. Darkness retreats slightly. Crime does not vanish, but fear softens around the edges. People walk farther after sunset. Shops stay open later. The city's usable hours expand. For women especially, these changes matter. The ability to move through the city with less physical risk alters social boundaries. Respectability is still policed, but mobility increases. Errands are easier, visits more frequent. Independence grows incrementally. Children's lives shift too. Play becomes less hazardous. School attendance improves when routes are safer. Shoes last longer. Injuries decrease, though they never disappear entirely. The street, once a constant reminder of neglect, begins to feel like shared space rather than obstacle. This shift carries psychological weight. When the city invests in its ground, it signals that those who walk on it are worth consideration. Yet not all streets benefit equally. Slums persist. Overcrowded courts remain muddy and dark. Reform stops at the edge of profitability or visibility. The poorest residents continue to navigate hazards long after others forget they existed. Still, the concept of public responsibility has expanded. The street is no longer merely a place things happen. It is something that can be shaped. Looking back, it becomes clear how dangerous familiarity can be. For decades, people accepted hazardous streets because they had never known anything else. Mud and manure felt inevitable. Only when alternatives appeared did neglect become visible. The Victorian street teaches a quiet lesson, that endurance often disguises injustice. People adapt so thoroughly to harmful conditions that change seems unnecessary until it finally arrives and reveals how much effort survival once required. Modern streets, smooth and regulated, carry this history invisibly. Beneath asphalt lie older layers of neglect, labor, and compromise. Every safe step rests on decisions made by people who were tired of falling. And as one everyday danger receded underfoot, others remained inside homes, workplaces, and even leisure waiting to be recognized as equally unacceptable. That realization leads naturally to the next story, where danger did not lie in the open street, but inside the very walls meant to protect. Story 4: Inside the home. Gaslights, wallpaper, and invisible poisons. You step inside, expecting safety, warmth, and quiet, and find instead a subtle, invisible hazard waiting for you. The Victorian home, especially in urban areas, is a paradox. It is meant to protect, but often amplifies risk. It is private, yet suffused with the smells, dust, and dangers of the city. Inside, the air can be just as deadly as the streets outside, though far less obvious. Gaslight is the first thing you notice. By the mid-19th century, gas lamps have moved from streets to homes. Their flickering yellow glow fills rooms once dark with crude illumination. They are convenient, reliable, and intoxicating. But they also produce carbon monoxide, a silent poison. Ventilation is minimal. Ceilings trap smoke, soot, and fumes. A family may sit for hours in a room lit by gas, unaware that each breath carries risk. Smoke from cooking adds to the burden. Fireplaces and stoves burn coal or wood, creating indoor haze. Chimneys are often clogged or poorly designed. The warmth comes at a price. Soot coats walls, ceilings, furniture, even the skin. Over time, respiratory irritation is inevitable. And then there is the wallpaper. It may be beautiful, patterned, bright, a sign of taste, respectability, or modernity. Yet many wallpapers are colored with arsenic or other toxic pigments. Green, especially, is fashionable and deadly. Damp conditions cause pigments to flake and release dust into the air. Breathing it may trigger headaches, nausea, or worse, especially in children. Long-term exposure weakens bodies silently, leaving no obvious sign until illness appears. Other materials contribute quietly to danger. Linoleum floors may release formaldehyde fumes. Carpets, rarely cleaned thoroughly, harbor dust, vermin, and lice. Curtains collect smoke and soot, acting as slow reservoirs for toxins. Furniture stuffed with horsehair and straw can harbor mold in damp seasons. Lighting, decoration, heating everything carries a hidden cost. Water is stored inside the home as well, often in open cisterns or containers. Pipes may be lead, tanks may be contaminated. By the time water reaches your cup, it has passed through materials that themselves threaten health. Boiling or filtering helps, but many families cannot afford consistent precautions. Cleaning rituals exist, but they are partial. Floors may be scrubbed weekly, tables wiped daily, clothing boiled when possible. Yet effort cannot remove everything. Dust settles again, invisible and relentless. Every human activity, sweeping, dusting, even sitting, stirs particles into the air. Children are particularly vulnerable. They play on floors, touch walls, breathe dust. They crawl under tables and chairs, putting hands in mouths after contact with wallpaper, dust, or soot. Their small bodies concentrate exposure. Infants sleep in shared beds, close to fumes from stoves or gas lamps. Newborns are exposed to hazards that adults may tolerate without noticing. Meals prepared at home carry risks too. Kitchens are small, poorly ventilated, often combined with living areas. Meat spoils quickly without refrigeration. Butter and milk go rancid. Mold develops. Flies thrive. Cooking fires provide heat but little protection from airborne bacteria. Foodborne illness is common, though the causes are poorly understood. And still, the home is the center of life. Despite danger, it is where people sleep, eat, and seek comfort. It is private, predictable, and under your control, unlike streets, workplaces, or public pumps. Families adapt. Windows are opened briefly when possible. Stoves are tended carefully, floors swept regularly, washing done when fuel allows. These habits do not eliminate risk, but they shape daily survival. Social norms reinforce risk as well. Ventilation may be resisted because draft is considered unhealthy. Dampness is feared, yet closed windows trap it. Fumes are tolerated because they are part of comfort and propriety. Convenience and safety often conflict. Compromise becomes a daily negotiation. And the worst dangers are invisible. Poisoned wallpaper, lead pipes, smoke, dust, fumes, these are not dramatic. They do not scream or crash. They kill slowly, subtly, and cumulatively. Survival depends on awareness, adaptation, and luck. You might wonder as you move from room to room, how many generations lived and died under these quiet hazards before anyone connected everyday home comforts to chronic illness? And what prompted society to finally confront the invisible poisons inside the very walls meant to protect its people? By midday, your home is alive with activity and hazards that almost seem ordinary because they are invisible. Cooking fires burn steadily, filling the kitchen with heat and the tang of coal smoke. Soot rises through every crevice, settling on furniture, carpets, and even your skin. The smell is familiar. You barely notice it anymore, though your lungs carry the subtle burden of decades of inhalation. The gaslights flicker overhead. They are convenient, allowing work, reading, and social visits after dark, but they do more than illuminate. Each room they touch holds an unseen risk. Carbon monoxide mixes with the warm air. Nitrogen dioxide irritates your lungs. The glow is inviting, but it is quietly lethal for those who spend hours beneath it. Children and the elderly are particularly vulnerable, though no one yet measures their exposure. Walls painted in vibrant greens, blues, and yellows conceal another danger. Arsenic-based pigments were widely used because they produced brilliant, fashionable colors. Over time, dampness causes paint and wallpaper to flake, creating dust that wafts into every corner of the room. Families sweep and dust as best they can, but each effort stirs arsenic particles into the air once more. Coughs, headaches, and persistent fatigue are dismissed as everyday inconveniences, yet they may be the body's first warnings of chronic poisoning. Furniture and upholstery add another layer of risk. Straw-stuffed mattresses harbor mites. Horsehair in chairs and couches can mold in humid conditions. Carpets trap dust, soot, and pest excrement. Even clothing contributes. Wool and cotton fibers, unwashed for days, carry soot and microscopic contaminants from the streets. Every item in the home is a conduit for risk, quietly intersecting with the human body in ways largely unnoticed. Water inside the home is a constant worry. Lead pipes are common in urban areas, leaching into drinking water slowly but persistently. Cisterns collect rainwater, sometimes contaminated by birds, insects, or nearby sewage. Boiling or filtering water reduces some risk, but fuel is expensive, and consistency is hard to maintain. Many households rely on routine rather than full understanding to stay alive, carrying buckets from public pumps they hope are safe enough. Children navigate these hazards instinctively. They crawl under tables, sit on carpets, and handle wallpaper scraps that flake from walls. Infants share beds with parents, often near stoves or fireplaces, inhaling smoke and arsenic-laden dust while sleeping. Mothers adapt, moving bedding or limiting play areas, but risk is omnipresent. The home is protective in one sense but deadly in another. Even the rituals of cleanliness and propriety carry contradictions. Drafts are feared, yet they ventilate rooms. Dampness is avoided, yet windows are closed tightly to conserve heat. Soap, water, and labor are precious resources. Floors are scrubbed when possible, but dust settles immediately afterward. Morality and health intermingle with practicality. To be clean is virtuous, yet cleanliness cannot eliminate danger entirely. The accumulation of risk is invisible but relentless. Every day, families inhale fumes, swallow contaminated water, and brush against poisoned surfaces. Illness may appear only years later. Chronic headaches, lung problems, or developmental delays in children are rarely traced to home hazards. Deaths are recorded in official statistics, but the slow, silent damage inside homes is poorly understood. Yet people persist, developing routines that mitigate risk as best they can. Open a window briefly, sweep daily, keep children away from flacking wallpaper. These small interventions are the true survival strategies of ordinary families. They represent human resilience against invisible threats, adaptations born from observation rather than scientific certainty. By evening, the home is alive with another danger: fatigue. Work outside the home, combined with household labor, leaves bodies tired and immune systems vulnerable. Fireplaces, stoves, and lamps provide warmth and light, but also extend exposure to toxic fumes. Every evening ritual from dinner to bedtime is layered with subtle hazards that few recognize fully. And still, the Victorian home teaches a profound lesson. Comfort, routine, and status often come at a hidden cost. Beauty and convenience are intertwined with risk. Survival requires both careful attention and resignation to unavoidable dangers. So as the day ends and you prepare for sleep beneath a gaslit ceiling, beside flacking wallpaper, and next to the warmth of a coal fire, one question lingers quietly in the back of your mind. How long would it take for society to see that the very homes built to protect life were also silently threatening it? And what changes would follow when these invisible poisons could no longer be ignored? Change inside the Victorian home did not arrive suddenly. It came slowly, measured in reports, experiments, and gradual shifts in public understanding. By the late 19th century, physicians and chemists had begun to identify the dangers that had been quietly poisoning households for decades. Arsenic in wallpaper, lead in pipes, fumes from gas lighting and coal stoves, these were no longer invisible mysteries. Scientific inquiry began to reveal the cumulative effects of exposure, though society often resisted what it did not want to believe, that comfort, taste, and wealth could harbor death. Reform often followed tragedy. Children suffered developmental delays from lead exposure. Families fell ill repeatedly without obvious cause. The correlation between indoor conditions and chronic illness grew impossible to ignore. Public health campaigns began, though slowly and unevenly, to educate citizens and enforce regulations. Wallpaper was among the first visible changes. Bright arsenic greens faded from homes, replaced by pigments that were safe or at least less harmful. Manufacturers were pressured to reform. Damp walls were ventilated more intentionally. Households learned that beauty could no longer justify poison. Water systems were addressed as well. Lead pipes were replaced with safer materials. Cisterns were covered. Boiling and filtration became more widely recommended as public health knowledge spread. Families adapted practices that had previously been inconsistent, turning luck and observation into informed habit. Gas lighting, once celebrated for convenience, underwent scrutiny too. Ventilation was emphasized. Chimneys and flues were cleaned regularly. People learned to recognize the subtle symptoms of exposure: headaches, fatigue, dizziness. Awareness alone reduced risk, even before complete technological solutions were in place. The home became a site of experiment as much as comfort. Architects, engineers, and reformers began to consider how spaces could be designed to maximize health. Windows positioned for cross-ventilation, stoves isolated to prevent indoor smoke, and materials chosen for safety rather than purely for appearance. Yet even as awareness grew, many hazards persisted. Poverty limited the ability to make changes. Tenement dwellers continued to live in overcrowded, damp, poorly ventilated homes. Wealthy families could implement precautions, but risk was rarely eliminated entirely. Survival remained a negotiation between knowledge, resources, and adaptation. The Victorian household, in other words, never became completely safe, but it did change. Awareness allowed action. Knowledge prompted regulation. Small, incremental improvements accumulated over decades, shifting mortality rates, reducing chronic illness, and reshaping the very concept of domestic life. And the lesson of the home remains quietly profound. The spaces meant to protect us can also be the spaces that most threaten us when we ignore invisible hazards. Comfort without awareness is vulnerability. Beauty without caution is risk. Survival depends not only on endurance but on perception, understanding, and adaptation. When you reflect on these transformations, it becomes clear how far society had to move to recognize what had always been present. That life's most insidious dangers are often the ones closest to us, hidden in plain sight. And it leads to a final, unsettling question. What other ordinary aspects of modern life might be quietly harmful, waiting for future generations to uncover the truth the present overlooks? Story 5. The Workplace of Peril, Factories, Fumes, and the Cost of Industry. You arrive at the factory before sunrise, stepping into a space where routine and danger coexist so tightly that you barely notice one until it strikes. The factory is large, cavernous, and relentlessly noisy. Iron girders rise overhead, supporting the roof but also echoing every clang, every footstep, every shout. Smoke and dust swirl in beams of pale light, reducing visibility and coating everything it touches with fine grit. The smell hits first: oil, coal, sweat, and the faintly sweet tang of chemical processes. It is a smell you get used to, though it never becomes pleasant. Your lungs carry it layer upon layer, inhaled with every breath you take for the next 12 or 14 hours. Respiratory irritation, chronic coughing, fatigue, these are ordinary side effects of life here, as accepted as hunger or hunger's avoidance. Machines dominate the space. Steam engines rumble in the background, powering belts that spin gears, wheels, and other machinery in precise but unforgiving synchronization. Each belt, pulley, and cog moves with an indifference to human fragility. Fingers, hair, clothing, anything can be caught. Accidents happen quickly, silently, often leaving victims with a permanent reminder: lost fingers, crushed hands, severed limbs. You have to learn the rhythm. The factory floor has its own language: the whoosh of steam, the clatter of metal, the squeal of leather belts. You time your steps to avoid collisions. You memorize paths between machines. You learn which operators are prone to error and which are careful, because mistakes made by others can be just as deadly to you as your own misjudgments. Heat is pervasive. Coal-fired engines generate warmth that can be oppressive in summer, especially when ventilation is minimal. Workers perspire heavily, their clothing sticking to them. Water is scarce and precious, and sweat adds to the grime that already covers the floor. In winter, the heat shifts. Near the boilers, the air is stifling. Further away, it is bitterly cold. Maintaining a balance is a constant challenge. Chemical exposure adds another layer of risk. Factories producing dyes, chemicals, or textiles often use arsenic, lead, or other heavy metals. These substances enter the air, cling to fabrics, coat machinery, and travel home on clothing. Skin irritation, poisoning, chronic illness, these are long-term threats that coexist with the immediate dangers of moving parts. Child labor is routine. Children as young as 6 or 7 operate simple machinery, climb into tight spaces to oil gears, and run errands across the factory floor. They are small, fast, and often fearless, but equally vulnerable. Injuries are common. Supervisors tolerate it because productivity depends on cheap labor. Families accept it because survival does too. Women dominate certain areas: spinning, weaving, sorting, or cleaning machinery. Their work is physically demanding, repetitive, and often low-paid. They endure constant exposure to dust and chemical residues. Like children, they carry these risks home, unwittingly exposing families to toxins. You may notice skin irritation, respiratory problems, or fatigue that seems normal until patterns emerge over years. Lunchtime offers little relief. Meals are brought from home, often hurriedly eaten on benches or in corners. The air is thick. Sweat mixes with smoke. Food is eaten with grimy hands. Drinking water may come from a contaminated source, compounding the hidden hazards that follow workers home. Noise is relentless. Machinery produces a low, constant roar punctuated by sudden shrieks, clanks, and crashes. Conversation requires shouting, and even then instructions can be misheard. Long-term exposure affects hearing, though awareness is slow. Deafness becomes another invisible cost, accepted as part of survival. Injury is expected. Minor cuts, bruises, burns, and sprains are daily realities. Major accidents, amputations, fractures, or death happen frequently enough that workers know someone who has suffered. Compensation is limited, laws are minimal, and safety equipment is scarce or non-existent. You may watch a coworker suffer a hand injury, quickly wrapped and sent back to work. There is no time for full recovery. Wages must continue. The cycle of labor and injury repeats endlessly. You learn that endurance and observation matter more than heroics or skill. Survival depends on noticing patterns, avoiding hazards, and being lucky. And yet, despite the danger, life continues. Workers adapt, developing routines, signals, and strategies to minimize risk without eliminating it. Machines are powerful, but human ingenuity, care, timing, and awareness keeps catastrophe from becoming constant. Survival is a daily negotiation between human frailty and industrial necessity. At the end of a long shift, your body aches, lungs burn, and hands are calloused. Clothing is coated with grime, dust, and chemical residue. But tomorrow will be the same because survival requires income. Danger is routine. Adaptation is mandatory. Life persists in the hum of belts, the heat of steam, the dust of work, and the resilience of those who endure. And as you leave the factory and step into the street, you might wonder, how long can society tolerate invisible dangers so entwined with industry before regulations, science, and awareness force change? And what cost will be counted before workers' lives are truly valued? The danger you navigate in the factory is not limited to machinery or fumes. It extends to the very rhythms of life dictated by industrial labor. Work begins before dawn and ends long after dusk, 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours per day. You stand, move, lift, and stretch constantly. Your body becomes an instrument calibrated to the machines, and fatigue is a constant companion. Breaks are minimal. Meals are eaten quickly, often cold, in corners or near noisy machinery. Water is scarce or contaminated. Hygiene is nearly impossible. Sweat, soot, dust, and chemical residues accumulate relentlessly. The factory is a microcosm of Victorian risk. Everything necessary for life, air, movement, heat, sustenance, is also a vector for harm. Accidents continue to happen. You see coworkers lose fingers to belts, slip on oil-slick floors, or fall from platforms. Injuries are patched, bandaged, and ignored because productivity outweighs compassion. Those who survive learn quickly to anticipate danger, developing mental maps of every rotating cog, every pulley, every spout of steam. Anticipation is survival. Child labor amplifies the stakes. Children operate looms, tend small engines, carry loads across the floor. They are fast, agile, and often fearless, yet entirely vulnerable. A single misstep can lead to crushing injury or death. Supervisors and families alike accept this, rationalizing necessity over safety. In many homes, children are essential contributors to income, and the factory is a school of endurance as much as employment. Women face unique hazards. They are often assigned repetitive or detailed tasks, threading, sorting, cleaning, that require concentration, but expose them to dust, chemical residues, and constant strain. Their work is undervalued, and yet they are among the most exposed to invisible dangers that slowly compromise health. The air itself is toxic in subtle ways. Dust from fibers, soot from engines, chemical residues from dyes and cleaning agents, these coat lungs, hair, and skin. Chronic respiratory illness is common, though largely accepted as part of working life. Coughing is normalized. Wheezing is expected. The subtle toll of years spent inhaling contaminants often becomes apparent only in middle age, when the body begins to falter. Noise is relentless. The roar of machinery, the clatter of belts, the creak of engines, these are more than background. They are constant assault. Long-term hearing damage is inevitable. Communication is difficult. Shouting is required, yet even that is often insufficient. Workers develop signals, gestures, and learned patterns to convey instructions in the cacophony. Illness spreads quickly in the factory. Poor ventilation, crowded workspaces, and shared tools mean that infections from colds to tuberculosis move rapidly. Quarantine is impossible. Absence means lost wages. Survival depends on endurance, but also on social navigation. Knowing who is ill, avoiding contact when possible, and maintaining energy despite exposure. Despite all these dangers, life persists. People adapt in small but meaningful ways. Workers time their steps carefully around machinery. They develop communal signals to warn of hazards. Families adjust household routines to account for fatigue, injury, or contamination brought home from the workplace. These adaptations are informal, invisible to inspectors or managers, but essential to survival. Gradually, awareness spreads beyond the factory floor. Physicians, reformers, and journalists begin to document the cost of industrial labor. Reports detail injuries, fatalities, and chronic illness. Public pressure grows, though resistance remains strong. Factory owners prioritize profit, often at the expense of life. Legislation emerges slowly. Factory acts limit hours, mandate minimal safety requirements, and attempt to restrict child labor, but enforcement is uneven and gaps persist. Over time, industrial health begins to change, but incrementally. Machines are redesigned to reduce obvious dangers. Ventilation improves. Protective gear is introduced, though rarely standardized or sufficient. Knowledge accumulates. Exposure to dust, fumes, and repetitive labor has long-term consequences. Each small reform is a step toward valuing life within the relentless rhythm of work. And yet the cost of industry is deeply ingrained. Danger becomes normalized, endurance celebrated, suffering accepted. The factory teaches resilience at the expense of health. Survival depends on vigilance, adaptation, and sometimes luck. By the end of a long shift, your body is exhausted but alive. Your lungs burn, your hands ache, your hearing rings. You leave the factory to the streets outside where other hazards await, yet there is relief in motion, in air not saturated with machinery and chemicals. The lessons of survival, the mental maps, the anticipatory gestures, the constant negotiation with risk travel home with you. And as you pause outside, taking a breath that is free of belts, steam, and dust, you may wonder, how many lives were quietly sacrificed in the name of progress, and what finally compelled society to recognize that labor, safety, and human endurance are inseparable, and that one cannot thrive without valuing the others. Change in the industrial workplace came slowly, painfully, and often only after tragedy forced society to notice. Accidents, chronic illness, and child labor had long been treated as unfortunate but inevitable byproducts of progress. Survival depended on adaptation, endurance, and sometimes sheer luck. But over time, observation, advocacy, and science began to chip away at this normalization. Legislation became the first visible sign of transformation. The Factory Acts, incrementally introduced from the early 19th century onward, attempted to limit working hours, set age restrictions for children, and require minimal safety standards. These laws were not comprehensive at first. Enforcement was patchy, and gaps allowed abuses to continue. Yet they introduced the radical idea that labor itself could be regulated in the interest of life and health. Simultaneously, medical and social reformers documented the hidden costs of industrial work. They measured respiratory illnesses, mapped injury rates, and tracked long-term disabilities. They highlighted that what was once invisible, the slow toll of dust, fumes, repetitive strain, was real, measurable, and preventable. Reports were published, pamphlets distributed, and public awareness grew. Technical solutions followed. Machines were redesigned with guards, belts enclosed, and emergency stops added. Ventilation systems were improved, though still imperfect. Protective equipment appeared, from gloves to masks, slowly mitigating the dangers once accepted as unavoidable. Factories became, in small ways, safer without fundamentally slowing production. The human adaptation that had been critical for survival, vigilance, anticipation, communal signals, careful observation, remained essential. Safety devices reduced risk but did not eliminate it. Endurance was still required, though less heroically than in the earlier decades. Child labor declined gradually as education became compulsory, and laws were enforced more effectively. Families adjusted to changes in income patterns, and society slowly recognized that survival was not solely the responsibility of the individual or household, but a shared obligation. Yet even as reforms took hold, the story of industrial peril left a lasting legacy. The rhythms of adaptation, the normalization of invisible hazards, and the intimate understanding of risk became part of the social memory. Generations of workers had survived by learning to navigate danger with observation and experience rather than formal knowledge. Those lessons shaped attitudes toward labor, resilience, and safety for decades. The factories themselves remained powerful symbols. They were engines of progress, wealth, and technological innovation, but also sites where human life was measured against production. Change in the industrial workplace was always a negotiation between efficiency, profit, and human cost. Survival was both a personal strategy and a collective struggle. When you look back on this period, it is striking how ordinary life was intertwined with extraordinary risk. Millions of people endured environments designed without their well-being in mind, yet they persisted, adapted, and sometimes even thrived. The incremental reforms that followed laws, technical improvements, awareness campaigns demonstrate that societal recognition of hidden hazards is both slow and necessary for meaningful change. And so, you leave the factory at day's end, lungs burning, ears ringing, hands calloused. You step into the streets and reflect that life itself had always been a negotiation with risk. Survival depended on endurance, knowledge, adaptation, and above all, the slow, collective realization that human life mattered enough to reshape the environment that threatened it daily. And as you pause to catch your breath, the question lingers. How many invisible dangers both then and now continue to exist in workplaces, homes, and everyday life, waiting for recognition before society finally values the lives quietly exposed to them? Story 6. Epidemics in Everyday Life. Smallpox, vaccination, and public fear. You wake to a quiet morning that is deceptively ordinary. Children run to breakfast, the bread is sliced and buttered, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke drifting in from neighboring chimneys. Yet beneath the calm, the city carries an invisible tension, because disease can arrive without warning, slipping through the very routines meant to sustain life. Smallpox is a constant, lurking threat. By the early 19th century, it has already killed millions across Europe over centuries, shaping families, communities, and the very fabric of urban life. It is not merely a historical fact. It is a presence felt in homes, workplaces, schools, and streets. Every cough, every rash, every fevered child carries a shadow of fear. The disease is distinctive. It begins subtly: fever, malaise, headaches. Then the telltale pustules appear, first on the face, then spreading across the body. The skin becomes a map of suffering, raised, blistered, and ultimately scarred. Survivors are left with permanent marks. Mortality is high, especially among children. Some die quietly at home, others in hospitals, crammed with patients where infection spreads more easily. Isolation is crude, often ineffective, and stigmatizing. Vaccination emerges as a tool of prevention, yet it is controversial. Edward Jenner's experiments with cowpox in the late 18th century demonstrate a method to protect against smallpox, but widespread adoption is slow. Public fear intersects with distrust. People question safety, motives, and morality. Some families resist vaccination out of religious conviction, others out of skepticism. The very act of prevention is politically, socially, and ethically contested. You might see vaccination stations set up in town halls or schools. Lines of anxious parents and children wait their turn. Needles prick flesh, leaving a faint mark, a minor inconvenience, a small risk compared to the devastation it prevents. Yet rumors abound that the vaccine might cause disease, deformity, or moral corruption. Resistance spreads alongside the virus itself, demonstrating that fear is often as contagious as infection. Smallpox does not respect wealth or class. It strikes the poor more severely due to crowded housing, malnutrition, and poor sanitation, but outbreaks also touch the middle and upper classes. Fear, however, manifests differently. Wealth can buy distance, access to physicians, private rooms, and safer environments. Poverty offers no such protection. The poor endure not only the disease but its social and economic consequences: lost labor, funeral costs, and stigma. Quarantine is the standard response during outbreaks. Houses are cordoned off, families are confined, food, water, and care must be delivered carefully. Fear spreads faster than the virus itself. Neighbors avoid contact. Markets become sparse. Schools close. The rhythms of everyday life are suspended. Survival is as much about navigating social isolation as avoiding infection. Public health authorities gradually intervene. Boards of health issue notices, track outbreaks, and enforce isolation. Data is collected, but understanding remains imperfect. Germ theory has not yet replaced miasma thinking. Disease is still often blamed on bad air or moral failings. Despite good intentions, containment is inconsistent and the toll remains high. Children in particular are at risk. Families may attempt to shield them, but exposure is difficult to prevent. Siblings carry infection home from schools or street play. Vaccination offers hope, but supply, accessibility, and public acceptance limit its effectiveness. Smallpox is both visible and invisible. Its scars are permanent, its transmission stealthy. And yet humanity endures. Communities develop rituals to cope: early isolation, herbal remedies, prayers, and social norms designed to reduce risk. Survival depends not only on medicine but on observation, adaptation, and social cooperation. The rhythm of life continues around the epidemic, though always with caution, fear, and vigilance. At the end of the day, as you check on children, sweep floors, and prepare for sleep, the question remains: how could a disease so visible in its devastation be so invisible in its spread? And what did it take for society to embrace vaccination as the shield it eventually became? The next day, life continues, but the shadow of smallpox looms everywhere. Children are sent to school with whispered instructions: avoid contact, wash hands, do not share cups. Adults move cautiously through markets and streets, observing neighbors with an unspoken vigilance. The city has adapted to a constant, silent threat, learning to navigate risk even when the enemy is invisible. Vaccination is gaining attention, but it is not universally trusted. Families weigh benefits against fear, skepticism, and tradition. Rumors spread quickly. Vaccines could cause illness, deformity, or moral corruption. Medical pamphlets attempt to reassure the public, but literacy varies, and personal experience often outweighs instruction. Social pressure plays a role. If a neighbor refuses vaccination, others may follow. Fear and conformity coexist uneasily with hope. Medical professionals, however, continue to advocate for systematic vaccination. They travel from town to town, offering the procedure for free or at reduced cost. They track outbreaks meticulously, noting where vaccinated individuals avoid disease and where unvaccinated communities suffer. Patterns emerge. The vaccine works, and the more widely it is adopted, the fewer lives are lost. Evidence grows steadily, even if acceptance is slow. The disease itself continues its quiet campaign. When smallpox reaches a household, families act quickly. Sick rooms are prepared, bedding, clothing, and personal items are isolated. Care is provided, but always with caution. Helpers wear whatever protection is possible, though rudimentary, because transmission is not fully understood. Contact spreads disease silently. Every breath, every touch is fraught with danger. Urban density exacerbates the problem. Poor neighborhoods, with crowded housing and minimal ventilation, become epicenters of infection. Wealthy districts are insulated by space and resources, yet outbreaks still occur because the virus is relentless. Survival is often as much about circumstance and geography as personal hygiene or behavior. Public health authorities respond unevenly. Notices are posted. Houses are quarantined. Occasionally, entire streets are cordoned off. Enforcement varies with the wealth and influence of residents. Social stigma attaches quickly. Families with infection may be shunned. The threat of disease becomes social as well as physical. Survival requires navigating not only contagion but human judgment and fear. Children experience smallpox both directly and indirectly. Many succumb to the illness before adulthood. Survivors bear permanent scars and sometimes blindness. Their futures are reshaped by the epidemic, education interrupted, labor delayed, social opportunities limited. Families adjust. Siblings take on responsibilities. Parents work longer hours to replace lost labor. The epidemic's impact is profound, yet often hidden behind daily routines. Vaccination slowly begins to change this calculus. Communities that embrace the procedure see reduced mortality. Parents learn through observation. Children who are vaccinated fare better. outbreaks are less severe, and life continues with fewer interruptions. The logic of prevention becomes evident, but full acceptance is gradual, mediated by fear, rumor, and tradition. The visible and invisible intersect in striking ways. The pustules and scars of smallpox are obvious to all, yet the virus's spread remains hidden until illness appears. Vaccination, meanwhile, is an invisible intervention, its success measured by absence. Fewer deaths, fewer sick children, fewer quarantines. Society begins to understand that prevention is as powerful as treatment, even if it requires trust in unseen forces. And yet, resistance persists. Some reject vaccination outright, claiming interference with divine will or natural law. Others cannot access the vaccine due to cost, geography, or social barriers. Epidemics persist, even as solutions exist. Survival depends not only on medicine but on navigation of complex social, cultural, and economic landscapes. By evening, the city has learned something subtle. Life continues around the threat, but awareness and small actions, vaccination, quarantine, careful observation accumulate into real protection. Each intervention is minor on its own, but together, they reshape risk and survival. Humanity begins to grasp that life can be protected, not only by endurance but by collective foresight. And as the day ends and you check on children, wash bedding, and consider tomorrow, a quiet thought lingers. If the success of vaccination relies on trust, observation, and slow social acceptance, how many lives were quietly lost while society debated fear, faith, and evidence? And what lessons might that history hold for facing invisible threats today? Over the decades, smallpox began to change the rhythm of everyday life in ways both subtle and profound. Communities that embraced vaccination saw fewer outbreaks, fewer deaths, and fewer interruptions to daily routines. What once seemed like an inevitable part of childhood, the fear, the fever, the pustules, the funerals, slowly receded into memory. For those who survived, scars became reminders of both vulnerability and resilience. Legislation followed observation. By the mid to late 19th century, governments in Britain and parts of Europe passed laws making vaccination compulsory for children. Enforcement was uneven, but the principle was clear. Society recognized that collective action could prevent individual tragedy. Public health became a shared responsibility, a radical departure from earlier assumptions that disease was fate or moral failing. Medical professionals, previously dismissed or mistrusted, became advocates for routine prevention. Doctors and nurses traveled to schools, parishes, and homes, offering the vaccine, explaining its purpose, and observing the results. Families began to recognize patterns. Children who were vaccinated fell ill less often. Communities that prioritized prevention experienced fewer epidemics. Trust grew, slowly but steadily. Resistance persisted. Religious objections, fear of side effects, and distrust of authority lingered for generations. Some families hid children or refused compliance outright, and outbreaks still occurred among the unvaccinated. Yet these pockets of vulnerability underscored the broader lesson. Disease thrives where social cooperation fails. Protection depends not only on science, but on participation, education, and trust. The impact on urban life was dramatic. Schools remained open, children's play was less interrupted, and families navigated daily routines with reduced fear. Economic activity became more predictable. Life regained a measure of normalcy, not through miraculous cures, but through prevention, organization, and observation. Society had learned that the invisible could be managed if collective attention was applied. The smallpox struggle left a deeper imprint as well. It demonstrated the interplay between fear, habit, and social norms. Ordinary people endured constant threat because it was normalized. Progress arrived only when evidence, advocacy, and regulation converged. Survival was never purely individual. It depended on neighborhoods, communities, and institutions working in tandem. For you observing this as a historical narrative, the lesson is striking. Invisible threats can dominate lives quietly, shaping daily routines, social expectations, and even cultural attitudes. Human ingenuity through observation, adaptation, and gradual adoption of scientific methods can mitigate what once seemed inescapable. Yet it requires persistence, trust, and sometimes generations of effort. And so, as you reflect on the journey of smallpox and vaccination, one final thought emerges. The invisible dangers of one era become the overlooked lessons of the next. If society had waited for complete certainty before acting, countless lives would have been lost. How many contemporary invisible threats do we tolerate today, unknowingly shaping daily life while waiting for clarity, evidence, or social consensus? Story 7. Hunger in the City, Poverty, Food, and Survival in Victorian Streets. You step out into the city at dawn, and the first thing you notice is the smell or perhaps the lack of it. There is no fresh bread, no roasting meat, no market bustle offering the promise of sustenance. Instead, you are surrounded by the faint odor of coal smoke, damp streets, and the faint tang of decomposing refuse. Hunger is invisible at first, like a low hum in the body, but it shapes everything: posture, thought, and the rhythms of daily life. In the Victorian city, poverty is both a visible and invisible hazard. Streets are crowded, and housing is often squalid. Families are packed into single rooms, sharing beds, air, and meals. Food is expensive and scarce. Nutritional knowledge is limited. Many survive on bread, tea, and the occasional vegetable, with meat appearing rarely, if at all. Malnutrition is common, weakening the body and lowering resistance to disease, yet it is largely normalized among the poor. Children are the most vulnerable. Their growth depends on food that is irregular, often insufficient, and sometimes unsafe. The streets become a site of survival. Children scavenge for scraps, peel potatoes discarded from markets, or seek sweet residues from bakeries. Their small bodies are engines of endurance, yet every day carries risk. Contaminated food, accidents, and illness lurk in every corner. Markets are both a blessing and a hazard. Vendors sell cheap goods: stale bread, bruised vegetables, spoiled meat, but what is affordable is rarely healthy. Buyers learn to judge freshness by sight and smell, sometimes relying on instinct rather than knowledge. Contaminated food spreads illness quickly, particularly in densely packed neighborhoods. Survival becomes a delicate calculation: cost versus safety, hunger versus risk. Work shapes access to food. Families rely on wages earned in factories, workshops, or as domestic servants. Irregular hours, low pay, and the physical demands of labor mean that food must be rationed. Lunchtime is brief and utilitarian: a crust of bread, some tea, a piece of cold meat if fortune allows. Children may eat less than adults, sacrificing their share so that the primary earners can function. Hunger is structural, a consequence of urban labor systems and economic inequality. Charitable institutions exist, but they are limited. Soup kitchens, workhouses, and parish assistants provide some relief, but they come with stigma, strict rules, and insufficient portions. Visiting a workhouse for food might save a family from starvation, but it could also trap them in cycles of labor and dependence. The poor negotiate survival in a social landscape that is simultaneously hostile and necessary. Food storage is another challenge. Iceboxes are rare. Refrigeration is largely non-existent. Fresh meat and dairy spoil quickly. Families rely on dry goods, flour, beans, and preserved foods, or must shop daily. Every decision carries weight. A missed purchase could mean going hungry, while spoiled food could cause illness. Hunger is not only physical but also constant calculation and vigilance. Street vendors offer occasional relief. Pies, fried snacks, and confections are sold cheaply, tempting children and adults alike. These purchases are small victories against hunger, but they are insufficient for true sustenance. Sugar and fat provide energy temporarily but leave bodies craving more. Survival is measured in cycles of hunger, consumption, and delayed satisfaction. Yet there is a rhythm to endurance. Families develop routines, rationing food carefully, sharing portions strategically, and making small luxuries last. Children learn how to avoid being sent out too far, where the risk of accidents, theft, or punishment might outweigh the potential reward of scraps. Every action is a negotiation between necessity and danger. And as you move through this landscape of scarcity, observing streets filled with silent hunger, one question persists. How did families endure for decades under constant dietary stress? And what small adaptations, social, physical, and cultural, allowed survival in the face of relentless scarcity? The rhythm of hunger shapes every movement and choice in the Victorian city. Children rise early to help scavenge for food or prepare simple meals. Parents wake before dawn, sometimes skipping breakfast themselves, to ensure that the limited resources they have last through the day. Hunger is constant, a silent pressure that bends daily life towards survival. Markets remain central to sustenance, but they are fraught with hazards. Fresh produce is scarce in the poorest neighborhoods. Bread is often stale or made from inferior flour. Meat, when affordable, risks contamination due to poor refrigeration or adulteration with fillers like sawdust or chalk. Families learn to detect these hazards, developing knowledge passed from parent to child. Observation and experience become survival tools. Sniff, touch, inspect before consuming. Ignorance can be deadly. Street life becomes a supplement to domestic hardship. Children roam alleyways, seeking discarded food from markets, bakeries, or restaurants. They pick through ash heaps, peel potatoes thrown aside, and retrieve scraps that might feed a family for a few hours. These scavenged meals are risky, often contaminated, yet they are essential. Small victories against hunger are celebrated quietly and shared with caution. Work dictates access to food. Factory laborers, domestic servants, and street sellers spend long hours earning minimal wages. Money earned must be divided. Rent, fuel, clothing, and food compete for scarce resources. Lunches are brief, sometimes improvised from leftovers, and often insufficient to sustain energy for physically demanding labor. Hunger becomes not just a daily experience, but a shaping force of endurance and resilience. Public assistance is limited and stigmatized. Soup kitchens and workhouses provide calories, but at a cost. Workhouses are harsh, punitive environments. Families are sometimes separated. Charity comes with rules, shame, and limited amounts. Even when help is available, survival often depends on a family's ability to navigate bureaucracy, shame, and competition for scarce resources. Hunger is both physical and social. Disease intersects with scarcity. Malnourished bodies are vulnerable to infection, whether from contaminated water, air, or food. Illness spreads quickly in crowded neighborhoods, further limiting the ability to obtain food or work. A single outbreak can devastate a family, forcing them to rely more heavily on charity or scavenging. Survival becomes a negotiation between scarcity and exposure, between hunger and risk. Adaptations emerge in quiet ways. Families ration food meticulously, sometimes hiding portions to ensure children or breadwinners survive. Children learn which streets to search for scraps safely, avoiding danger from traffic, crime, or exploitation. Creativity in cooking, stretching flour into puddings, repurposing stale bread becomes both necessity and skill. These strategies are learned, observed, and passed down, forming an informal survival curriculum. Hunger shapes psychology as well as the body. Anticipation of scarcity affects mood, decision-making, and interactions. Families plan meals days in advance, worry constantly about shortages, and live with the tension of knowing that a single misstep, a spoiled loaf, a missed market can have immediate consequences. Stress is chronic, yet normalized. The city hums with unacknowledged struggle, each household quietly calculating survival. Yet despite these pressures, life continues. Work, play, social interaction, and family bonds endure, all under the shadow of scarcity. Hunger is a constant companion, shaping bodies, routines, and relationships. Adaptation, observation, and ingenuity are essential for endurance. And as you witness this delicate balance between survival and deprivation, the persistent question emerges: how did communities maintain resilience, human connection, and adaptation under decades of chronic hunger? And what unnoticed lessons about endurance and resourcefulness might modern society overlook when comfort and abundance are taken for granted? Gradually, small changes began to reshape the landscape of hunger, though not uniformly or rapidly. Charitable organizations expanded their reach, providing soup kitchens, bread funds, and school meals for children. Municipal reforms improved sanitation, reducing disease that compounded malnutrition. Employment opportunities fluctuated, sometimes improving access to food, though wages often remained insufficient for a full, nutritious diet. Families continued to adapt, developing strategies that had been honed over decades of scarcity. Bread might be soaked to stretch it across meals. Vegetables discarded by markets were repurposed into soups or stews. Leftovers were carefully saved, shared, and rotated. Children's small scavenging expeditions became routine, ensuring that each day brought at least minimal sustenance. These practices, born of necessity, reflected ingenuity, observation, and quiet resilience. Markets slowly improved. Better regulation reduced the sale of adulterated flour, spoiled meat, and contaminated food. Cheaper sources of fresh produce became available through urban distribution networks, though only marginally improving the diet of the poorest. Nutritional awareness grew slowly among reformers, influencing charitable programs and school meals. Incremental change mattered, though hunger did not disappear overnight. School meals, in particular, became a tool for survival and education. Children who had little to eat at home could rely on modest provisions during the day, reducing fatigue, improving attention, and protecting health. Nutrition began to intersect with social policy, reflecting a growing understanding that hunger was not simply a private problem but a public concern. Yet the lessons of chronic scarcity endured. Hunger shaped social behaviors, family structures, and survival strategies in ways that persisted even as material conditions improved. Communities remained vigilant, accustomed to careful planning, observation, and ingenuity. Food was never taken for granted. Even small shortages prompted immediate attention, reflecting a collective memory of deprivation. The psychological imprint of hunger was profound. Adults carried caution into every decision, balancing cost, effort, and risk in ways that modern observers might find exhausting. Children learned adaptability, resourcefulness, and acute awareness of social and environmental hazards. Scarcity became a lens through which the world was measured, shaping expectations and behaviors for a lifetime. And yet these adaptations highlight the quiet triumph of resilience. Ordinary families, living under relentless scarcity, found ways to survive, preserve dignity, and maintain human connections. They managed risk, navigated complex urban environments, and negotiated social norms, all while enduring daily hunger. Survival was never accidental. It was learned, passed down, and refined over generations. As you step back from these streets, consider the broader lesson. Scarcity shapes society in profound ways. It molds behavior, ingenuity, and endurance. It also reveals the interplay between individual effort, communal knowledge, and structural limitations. The endurance of Victorian families amidst hunger demonstrates that survival is as much about adaptation and observation as it is about resources. And so, as the city quiets at night, with empty streets echoing faintly with the memory of scavenged meals and carefully rationed bread, one thought remains. How many lessons about resilience, resourcefulness, and human endurance born from scarcity remain hidden in plain sight, waiting for societies of abundance to recognize their quiet significance? Story 8: Water, Waste, and Disease. Life in the London Sewers. You descend into the streets of London, not above ground, but into the hidden veins that carry the city's lifeblood, its sewers. Below the cobblestones and bustling thoroughfares, an invisible world pulses with danger, necessity, and human adaptation. It is dark, damp, and suffused with the constant stench of human waste, industrial runoff, and chemical leaching. For most, it is entirely invisible, but for the city's planners, laborers, and epidemiologists, it is central to survival. Water, once taken for granted, is a complex and treacherous commodity. The Thames, London's lifeline, supplies drinking water, industrial water, and waste disposal simultaneously. Untreated sewage flows directly into rivers, mixing with drinking supplies. Contamination is inevitable. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery find fertile ground in these conditions, spreading silently through communities before anyone realizes a threat exists. Daily routines above ground disguise the peril below. Families draw water from pumps or wells, trusting the supply without knowing its source or safety. Laundry is rinsed in rivers or collected rainwater. Cooking and drinking rely on water that may harbor pathogens invisible to the eye. Survival depends on observation, timing, and luck. Even seemingly mundane habits, boiling tea, filtering water through cloth, become critical strategies for avoiding illness. The sewers themselves are a microcosm of Victorian urban life, laborious, dangerous, and essential. Mudlarks, scavengers who combed riverbanks at low tide for salvageable materials, risked drowning, infection, and arrest. Sewer workers, often poor or desperate, entered subterranean tunnels to clear blockages or maintain flow, enduring unbearable odors, rats, and disease exposure. The work is grueling, the pay minimal, yet it is necessary to keep the city functioning. Urban density amplifies the problem. Overcrowded neighborhoods with inadequate plumbing suffer most. Diseases spread rapidly when drinking water, waste disposal, and living spaces overlap. Mortality rates spike, yet these deaths are often normalized as part of urban life. Families learn to recognize early signs of disease and implement small survival strategies. Avoid certain water sources, consume food with caution, and limit contact with visibly sick neighbors. These adaptations are informal but essential. Industrial runoff complicates the picture. Factories discharge chemicals into streets and rivers, creating additional invisible hazards. Lead, arsenic, and other toxins enter waterways, contaminating drinking supplies, affecting crops, and adding to the slow accumulation of risk in urban bodies. The interplay of human and industrial waste is subtle but deadly, forming a hidden network of danger woven into the city's daily life. Public perception is fragmented. Wealthier citizens move to neighborhoods with safer water sources, pay for private wells, or rely on filtration. Poor residents must navigate contaminated supplies with little choice. Risk is unevenly distributed, yet everyone is connected. Disease does not respect social boundaries, even if the effects are more severe for those with fewer resources. Small innovations begin to appear, though unevenly. Water pumps are relocated, cisterns covered, and rudimentary filtration attempted. Sewers are mapped, partially expanded, and maintained, often by the poorest laborers. These interventions are small steps against a systemic problem. They mitigate risk but do not eliminate it, leaving survival dependent on both awareness and chance. The city above ground moves in ignorance of the hazards below. Streets bustle, markets thrive, and children play near rivers that are secretly conduits of disease. Life continues with adaptations invisible to casual observers. Boiling water, avoiding certain wells, rationing exposure to contaminated areas. Knowledge, careful observation, and small preventive actions become essential for endurance. And as you consider the networks of water, waste, and disease, one unresolved thought emerges. How long could a city survive while its lifeblood, the water it drinks, the waste it produces, remain dangerously intertwined? And what ultimately forces societies to confront hazards that are both invisible and essential? The invisible dangers of water and waste shape life above ground in ways that most residents never fully perceive. Households, streets, and neighborhoods are connected to the same systems that channel disease, contamination, and decay. Survival is not merely about avoiding visible hazards, it is about understanding patterns, timing actions, and developing subtle strategies that reduce exposure. Cholera outbreaks provide a grim example. By the early 19th century, London had endured repeated epidemics. The disease strikes suddenly, spreading through contaminated water and food, leaving diarrhea, dehydration, and death in its wake. Families observe early warning signs, neighbors falling ill, unusual smells, and unexplained sickness among children. Adaptive behaviors emerge, boiling water when possible, avoiding certain water pumps, and limiting contact with those who are visibly ill. These everyday strategies become informal survival techniques. The sewers themselves are an unseen battleground. Workers navigate dark tunnels filled with toxic gases, rotting waste, and vermin. Methane and hydrogen sulfide create hazards that can knock a person unconscious within moments. Rats thrive, carrying additional disease. Sewer maintenance is essential to the functioning of the city, yet the labor is brutal, poorly compensated, and risky. Those who work below the streets become experts in anticipating collapse, gas pockets, and blockages, developing a knowledge born of necessity and experience rather than formal education. Industrial waste compounds the risks. Factories discharge chemicals, dyes, and byproducts into drains and rivers. Lead, arsenic, and other toxins enter waterways, exposing workers and residents alike. Children fetching water or playing near polluted rivers are particularly vulnerable. Survival relies on both observation and luck, knowing which water sources are safer, which streets avoid chemical runoff, and how to treat water before use. Public health measures begin to emerge, often prompted by catastrophe. Epidemiologists like John Snow trace outbreaks to contaminated pumps, mapping cases with meticulous care. Authorities implement quarantines, relocate water sources, and encourage filtration. Sewers are expanded and redesigned, though slowly and unevenly. Education campaigns inform citizens about hygiene, boiling water, and avoiding contaminated supplies. Knowledge begins to translate into practical measures for survival, though adherence is uneven. Social disparities dictate exposure. Wealthy neighborhoods enjoy piped water from sources upstream of contamination, better sanitation, and private waste management. Poor neighborhoods remain vulnerable, with shared privies, clogged drains, and contaminated wells. Disease exploits these inequalities, reinforcing social stratification while remaining invisible in its mechanisms. Survival is unequal, dependent on resources, location, and knowledge. Adaptations extend into everyday routines. Laundry is washed carefully, floors are scrubbed, and water for cooking is boiled whenever fuel permits. Children are instructed on which water sources to use, which streets to avoid, and how to minimize contact with waste. These adaptations are learned, transmitted within families, and reinforced through experience. Life depends on vigilance, not merely chance. Even so, crises recur. Outbreaks strike unpredictably, testing both individual and collective strategies. Mortality spikes remind residents of the fragile balance between daily life and hidden hazards. Yet communities endure. Knowledge spreads slowly, interventions accumulate, and incremental improvements begin to reduce risk. Still, the city remains intertwined with invisible danger, demanding constant negotiation and attention. And as you rise from the depths of the sewers to the streets above, reflecting on water, waste, and disease, one lingering question arises. How much of daily survival depended on learned vigilance and informal knowledge? And how long must societies endure invisible hazards before systematic solutions are implemented? Change in London's approach to water, waste, and disease was neither swift nor linear. It came through observation, disaster, and incremental innovation. The memory of repeated cholera outbreaks visible in the rising death tolls, hearses lining streets, and families stricken with grief finally pushed society to confront hazards that had been ignored for decades. John Snow's investigations in the mid-19th century marked a turning point. By meticulously mapping cases of cholera during the 1854 Broad Street outbreak, he demonstrated that disease followed patterns of water contamination rather than bad air or moral failing, the prevailing miasma theory. His work revealed that survival depended on understanding the invisible mechanisms of hazard and adapting human behavior accordingly. Observation and evidence became tools as vital as rationed food or careful walking on crowded streets. Municipal engineering responded. The construction of extensive sewer networks, spearheaded by Joseph Basil Jett, revolutionized urban sanitation. Sewers were built to separate waste from water sources, carrying excrement away from homes and rivers. Pumping stations, covered drains, and improved filtration reduced the direct exposure of residents to deadly pathogens. These interventions were monumental, yet required years of labor, investment, and political will to complete. Water itself became a focus of regulation and improvement. Public health campaigns encouraged boiling water, proper storage, and careful sourcing. Urban planners recognized that invisible hazards could not be ignored, and that the infrastructure of survival required attention to systems rather than merely individual behavior. Knowledge transformed both policy and daily life. Yet even with reform, human adaptation remained critical. Residents continued to develop strategies for survival, inspecting water, choosing safer streets, limiting contact with visible waste, and teaching children to avoid dangerous sources. The invisible threats of the past had shaped behavior in ways that persisted long after engineering improvements were complete. Inequality remained a stubborn factor. Wealthy districts benefited first from clean water, pipe supply, and private sanitation, while poorer neighborhoods often lagged behind. Disease exploited these inequalities, demonstrating that survival is contingent on both personal vigilance and structural support. Understanding and addressing invisible hazards required attention to both systems and people. The broader lesson is clear. Survival in urban life depends not only on immediate action, but on observation, adaptation, and the willingness of society to act collectively. The hidden dangers of water and waste shaped daily life, influenced mortality, and prompted technological innovation. Lessons learned in London would echo worldwide, informing public health, sanitation, and urban planning for generations. And as you imagine walking along cobblestone streets above the network of sewers, considering the invisible currents of contamination, disease, and risk, one thought lingers. How many modern cities continue to grapple with hidden hazards, and what might we overlook today that future generations will study as essential lessons in survival, adaptation, and resilience?